Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. As you can see, the Street Fighter V Season 5 passes are available now.
Round 1. Fight!
Today we are mostly having the team train with each other, but we have quite a lot of space because we've split the groups today based on a couple of things that we want people to be able to work on that are more effective both with more focused play and with specific opponents within the team themselves. A lot of it is related to when to hit buttons in neutral, when to stop hitting buttons in neutral. And that's the one you're most likely going to be watching, depending on winning streaks.
Round 2.
And on the other side, which is not likely to be streamed, but we might get around to it, if you want to go join that lounge, it will mostly be about working on offense against some of our more defensive players. And this is good because the players that are having the most trouble with their offense are the ones that are generally themselves not offensive. Therefore, one of them is probably going to play the offense side and the other plays the defensive side in any given match and hope best. In order to find us, as usual, it is 3 rounds first to 2. Today character select is on to make things a little simpler. I've been corrected. Character select is off today, presumably because that was the plan to begin with and I thought it had changed. But this is to help people make sure to use their own characters. Actually, it's partially because we tried to change Kanzuki Dynasty's character to Karine as usual, but it's still displaying Ibuki, and we actually don't know what's going to happen when the match starts now. So I had all of that in my head already. Right now you are therefore watching Amara's Abigail and Wolf's Nikali face off. With the general setup of their match, as with nearly all Abigail matches, being making sure one doesn't push oneself out far enough that Abigail's back heavy punch becomes a problem. While still, of course, trying to play neutral against a character with particularly long reach.
It's a dead heat. Round 2. Fight!
So this side, as mentioned, this is the footsies side. If you feel as if your footsies are lacking, or particularly that you overdo it, keep on trying to hit buttons to make things go certain ways, you're probably looking for the Wolf's Lounge. And in the other case, you're probably looking for Just Fine.
Abigail wins.
One shouldn't just not jump or not stick out buttons, but you have to have at least some plan involved in it. Unless you're one of those people who has ascended to the point of just playing footsies automatically. And sometimes your automatic footsies don't go as well because of that. Well, let's see which character ends up actually happening. Because we definitely set it to Karine, but it might be Ibuki today. We may poke around at it to try to resolve it if it goes weird. No, it's sort of working. This will be great as long as we don't suddenly either find that we're looking at Ibuki in the match or find that Karine has all of Ibuki's moves.
That would be quite the show.
Round 1.
I'm not sure how janky that would even look. This matchup causes Kanzaki Dynasty quite a lot of trouble because Amara tends to keep on coming forward and has a decent understanding of when someone else is going to do so, and also enough buttons to reach, while still having enough advantage after being pushed back, as well as just general calm in the face of people hitting buttons, to not necessarily end up dying instantly. A lot of this is about micro spacing and being comfortable enough to think, I don't really need to hit you. I need to get to the spot where hitting you is a good idea. But what often happens with players who are trying to learn this is that they end up standing still a lot more. Standing still is fairly good. You can get yourself to stop doing too many things, but standing still and waiting for your opponent to mess up only works if your opponent isn't basically better at footsie than you, or in some cases just playing a better footsie character than you. Abigail is, in a weird way, a strong footsie character. Disregarding footsies in the right way and at the right time is also a form of it. By that I mean that characters who have armored moves but slower moves or not as much reach or not the best dash, which is usually how that works, often have a space where they are likely to use their armor when everyone else would have just dashed or jumped.
Round 1.
And this is in itself another form of footsie. If you decided, well, I'm going to check a dash or I'm going to hit a button because this is normally where my opponent tries to get in on me, it doesn't work as well against a character like Abigail because at the exact moment they're thinking about using their armor to go through whatever you hit. It can cause quite a few players to be much more aggressive than they would normally want to be, simply so that the opponent doesn't get to do anything annoying in time. Karine, fortunately, doesn't suffer so much from the other problem of having to deal with Abigail having advantage in a certain sequence and just being able to hit back a heavy punch and beat nearly any button she sticks out. She actually can reach and get some benefit out of her attacks, particularly her stand medium punch. But there's that moment we're talking about. You want to stop me from approaching. I know you're about to want this, therefore I'm going to armor through your attempt to stop me. This is particularly effective for Abigail because not only does Abigail have quite a far-reaching and lasting armor option, he also has a lot of different things he can do at the end of that option.
You lose.
But as we noted before, since we aren't absolutely sure what the type of person will be joining, if we start losing to someone who has joined a specific lounge but their style or goal seems to support more so the goal of the other lounge, we might rearrange some of the lounge members to one side or another. At which point, obviously, the lounge host will change, and I'll have to let you know once again who that is. The lounge parameters, however, shouldn't change, unless something has to go really weird and we end up having to recreate one. That could happen after a big switch and any confusion that could come up as a result of it, but for now, we're going to assume that things are going to stay as they are until I get word, or see here, that things are not as expected or as planned. But here we now have Ken, and we have discussed before that the quote-unquote crazy side of Ken is the point. You can't ever be sure that Ken will or will not do specific things. That's not what your goal is with the character. This is partially why our Ken bot is so focused around making sure you have all your punishes down, because what you want above all else is to make sure that when you hit Ken, you hit him really hard. And on top of that, that you don't get too caught up in whatever pacing the Ken player thinks is a good idea. Similarly, it can be very important to recognize when you shouldn't go for your big punish, primarily because the Ken player has attempted or plans to fake you out in some way. Ken has a lot of moves that make this possible. For example, in V-Trigger, his heavy Tatsu is in fact just about at the space where you can't be sure how to punish it, or rather technically you more or less can't. And even if you could, he just has invincible moves he can do after it. So if you end up blocking this move, which you probably should if your opponent has a good sense of rhythm, you will end up blocking it at some point. You can decide, well, should I keep blocking in order to get a big punish out of this, or take whatever little poke of damage Ken is probably going to go for. You can in fact, of course, tech the throw when the throw comes, but he can also delay things and make it frustrating to try this as a main thing, for example. In fact, if you're not willing to assume that you're going to get hit by a lot of Ken throws, you probably should not think too hard about your options against this character, because you'll start thinking about how to stop him from throwing you, and that is probably a bad idea, at least at the mid-levels. Ken has so many ways of getting to the throw that it was a big problem when he had options after it. This was changed at some point, I think at the end of Season 2?
Round 1.
In a big overhaul of that sort of thing. But if you are familiar with how Ken plays as a whole, you have to understand that, yes, the craziness and the getting thrown after certain parts of the craziness are part of the point. The character doesn't have to respect things you think are good ideas a lot of the time. It is for this reason that he does such a good job of teaching people to play from a more defensive stance, even though sometimes this means you're going to keep on getting thrown, keep on getting jumped on, eventually get tricked into one thing or another. This is just part of how that works. Thinking too much about it, or worrying too much when it goes wrong in a bad sequence, is kind of what the opponent is looking for. They want this to happen because they eventually get too stressed out to actually focus on the fact that it probably wasn't that big a deal. Maybe they got a good round, maybe they used all their meter properly, maybe you anti-aired from the wrong place. It doesn't really matter though, because that's how Ken works. If you put too much effort into stopping Ken from doing things instead of getting to the positions where it's a bad idea to do those things, you'll often find yourself very, very upset. In fact, as a whole, time you spend getting in on Ken after a knockdown without either a full plan to bait him or a reasonably strong feeling that he's not going to uppercut is more or less time wasted. You could spend much more of your time effectively if you spent it getting to positions where when Ken gets up, he doesn't immediately have a great option. And then of course, it helps if you do a lot of damage.
Abigail wins.
Doesn't look like they'll be sticking around, and this still says Ibuki. Well, whatever. So while this match goes on, I'm gonna go get some updates from the other lounge. Find out if anyone needs to be refactored into a different paradigm. And probably resume commentary either at the beginning of the next match or the one after that, especially if anyone has shifted sides or anyone joins this lounge.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! Polly wins. Round 1. Fight!
Looks like I've got more horsepower.
Round 2. Fight! Abigail wins. Round 1. Fight!
Looks like I've got more horsepower.
Round 2. Fight! Final round. Fight! Abigail wins. It's go time. Let's do this. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight!
bug. One of the most meaningful things that affects even
Round one.
top level players when they go to a new game, particularly a new type of game, or let's say a game with a new rhythm, is quite simply getting used to how long they have to punish something, particularly with punish something, and the speed of their own moves. People who have come from Street Fighter 4 and still talk about it will probably be able to tell you a lot about the fact that normals in Street Fighter 4 were just generally faster. On the whole, aside from the literally quickest ones, 1 to 2 frames faster, I guess across the board. Mediums are just generally faster in the game. They don't always have to be close mediums either, but definitely it does help. They are.
Round two.
This comes up in people's footsie playing often, and is a core reason for both, again, why we have bots, just to help you get familiarity, even if not matchup, just being able to see something happen enough times. And with less pressure, attempt to counter it. We also have general ways of causing the pressure to increase, you having to focus on counting your points, more extreme point systems, and so on. Or you can just attempt to simulate it to the best of your ability. Just think a lot about what it feels like to do certain things in certain matches, and technically stress yourself out. Abigail is one of the characters where this comes up the most, but Nikali is actually fairly heavy on these as well. A lot of Nikali's moves bring him very slightly forward, but because you have to pay more attention to whether or not you're about to be hit by the move, by the time you've recognized whether or not you keep blocking or not, you might not be able to get yourself to hit the button in time unless you're familiar enough. This is in fact why once you've gotten fairly good at our bots, especially if you started and did them in order, let's say, and you got good at inputting them through that, it's much better to change your Nikali bot to our Nikali bot 2, not because it's particularly different or is likely to help you understand a lot more about the Nikali matchup as a whole, but simply that it does more things and therefore you can get used to seeing and reacting to those things.
It's go time.
Still think she's playing a boogie.
Let's do this.
This guy says Karin Kanzuki. That's silly, of course, she doesn't have the hair. This comes up most often because the way Abigail's normals work, the player can never be sure what is going to happen once they're at a certain spot. In fact, unless you know this character really well, you should generally assume that if the Abigail player has hit more buttons at all, it was intentional. They didn't hit them to stop you from doing something because they're too slow for that. This is really important because one of the other factors that comes through there is that so many of Abigail's moves, other than the back heavy punch, and of course light punches, are so relatively slow or unrewarding that you're not necessarily going to get punished for doing things that Abigail has to react to. With punishing with actual big damage is not a strong suit of this character. More so, Abigail semi-predicts where you're going to be. And gets to the point where, because Abigail's moves are slower, yours is already halfway recovering by the time Abigail's reaches you. Since you can't easily get too close without at least getting punched at, it becomes a quick problem. You can't just decide, okay, it's my turn, because you have to get into range for that. And if you try to use a fake out, depending on what they had in mind, you're not going to get anywhere. That said, it makes Abigail fairly easy to whiff punish if you're the one watching for it. You just have to use your most middling button. You might have some confusions or problems if the button you hit is like trying to clip legs with a low, but he has ways around that. Something that aims more so toward his chest area, which is everyone else's head. Mainly because of the way back heavy punch works and so on. Your best bet is to just probably hit your medium punch, or for some characters, the medium kick. Aim and attack at Abigail's belt buckle as best you can, and assume it's going to hit any normals that were stuck out, or reach in time anyway, because a lot of Abigail's attacks extend body forward just enough to get clipped. Two ways to take even better advantage of this are walking backward, then when you just realize, oh, I am just outside of the range of you being able to quickly respond if I dash. Literally walk backward, then dash forward.
Round one. Fight.
Then block. Because you don't have enough time, usually, to actually hit anything, and you're not usually in range at that point, hopefully, to actually hit anything, compared to Abigail's options, that is. But the position you get into is more useful to you, similar to what we often mention relative to Dalsim. Except that with Dalsim you jump backwards to set this up first. Karine has the option of using Seppo, which can actually lead directly into attack if she thinks it's a good idea. But it's mostly the same sort of thing.
Round two. Fight.
Because Abigail tends to stand further out at these more comfortable ranges for Abigail anyway, there are also situations in which your standard combos just don't reach. And as you've just seen, being whiff punished specifically by EX Abigail punch can be kind of disheartening.
You win.
From the Abigail player side, the same sort of thing actually applies, and a large part of the reason why once you dash in you shouldn't just immediately hit a button is that most of the time the button you hit is going to be aimed, again, as mentioned, at Abigail's midsection. You don't really want to hit the button right away because eventually the Abigail player will get too used to you doing this and either armor, or if they don't have enough meter or idea that the armor will work, just parry and hope for the best. The reason this works against so many characters in the game is because despite the fact that there are quite a few crush counters that have very long reach, a lot of them really don't. And Again, it comes down to reaction time. But if you can get the player to think this is a good idea, I should make sure to hit more things. I should make sure to parry here, and so on. Dash up and pausing or blocking is a good idea. You've gotten yourself into a position or a situation where you could at least get something. This works particularly well for characters who have invincible moves because instead of dashing up or blocking, they can dash up and do those. And depending on what they are, it leads to Abigail having problems. It's not a suggested response to use super for this, but you'd still get something.
You lose. Let's do this. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Abigail wins. Round one. Fight!
Nikali can use this guidance in much a similar way, but because this guidance recovers differently than a dash does, you're somewhat reliant on the Abigail player not Not so much not knowing what to hit, but being wrong about how far they need to hit. Act. In short, you're not so much thinking I can get you to mistime this as I can get you to just miss outright. And depending on their mindset in the game, it could just not work at all. Abigail is an oppressive character. You spend a lot of time trying to get a situation clawed back into your favor against someone who, as long as they more or less choose the right sequence of attacks, you don't get to do that much in terms of directly responding to the strings. If you're playing like Ryu, this is easier, or sometimes just using an invincible reversal that goes far enough forward, like Ken or Cammy, but a lot of the other characters in the game have to deal with just being outspaced in a way that really matters. And on top of that, the additional health, the highest health in the game, means that you can't just presume that the lockdown situation is going to give you the win, even if you did manage to keep Abigail from doing anything for a relative long. Tag that on with the whole life leads aren't real problem. And it can be hard to keep calm enough to actually do what's required.
Final round. Fight.
But here you can already see it start to play out. If one has dashed up and gotten Abigail to hit the stand light punch, unlike nearly every other character where it's like, oh, I didn't reach them in time, now I'm close, they get to do pressure. Abigail's options after hitting crouch or stand light punch at max range are not that great. At least not if you've set up that situation in some way such that the spacing is the way you want it to and you have a strong expectation. Especially since in the worst case, you could just keep blocking and assume that they wouldn't be able to do much of anything.
Abigail wins. It's go time. Let's do this. Round one. Fight! Final round. Fight! You lose. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
Looks like I've got more horsepower.
Final round. Fight! KO. You lose. Let's do this.
I'm reminded that our 5 new characters are incoming and that I've already finished tentative development on Danbot, which means you might be able to get day 1 Danbot.
Fight!
Or at least I'll release the prototype on Twitter, since we have more Twitter letters now and it's relatively easy to write compared to most of them. If you're familiar with bots and just want to immediately dive into practice with Dan, you can probably check our Twitter to _MK_FGC soon after the Dan release, and I've had time to just make sure that the very basic kinks of it don't cause things to terribly explode. There's a little bit that we can't be sure of relative to Dan's priorities on inputs, and it's honestly a fairly complicated bot to input, being very similar to our Kage bot. Surprise, surprise. We're not absolutely certain how next week's stream will go as a result of that. It is the 15th now, and it was indicated that we would be getting things on the 22nd, so there may not in fact be a stream on next week Monday for Street Fighter 5, which is probably one of the rarer ones for us to not choose to do, or miss for any reason actually. This week, the lounges will also be closing much earlier, as they are much more of an intense training session, even if no one joins, given the intent. I would say even if you know your teammates, but it's more so specifically because one knows one's teammates that this happens. Because that additional familiarity does lead to more intense situations. There are things you can't get away with, not just in terms of mind games, but like tiny punishes, tiny walk back things that if you were facing another character or another person who you're not used to using those things, they might get away with more things. But here, it's more of a I've seen that trick 1,000 times, try something else. And of course, much less fear, because sometimes people will know, well, you're not that great on wake up, therefore whatever you do here is probably not going to ruin my day. This pressure is not going to kill me, I can be reversal you off me if I need to, etc. We'll be reserving our commentary on the new V-shift mechanic until we know what buttons you have to press for it to happen, as that is probably the most important aspect of it. Obviously this stands a chance to either enhance a bunch of bots, ruin a bunch of bots, or both, but we literally have no way to know what this is going to require. And all of the things I think of that would work, I'm not sure even those would be good ideas. Now, of course, if this information is somewhere online in some development diary stream or something that they told us already on the 15th exactly how to do this and I missed it, that's obviously my bad. But as it stands now, I don't know what buttons we're pressing to activate the V-shift. And I can't imagine it being safe enough to try to input for everyone without it being something crazy like hold 2 buttons and backdash. And for some characters, even hold 2 buttons and backdash is still a problem.
Round 2. Fight.
Because anything to the effect of, hey, hold these buttons, means that if you don't input it correctly, you'll probably end up doing something else. That said, that never technically stopped us in Street Fighter 4. So maybe other obvious options include cross combinations of light punches and kicks together. Or rather, light punch plus medium kick or something like that. Which, given most configs, someone will figure out a way to press this. Even on pad, there's a decent chance that one will be a face button, one will be a shoulder button, or
Abigail wins.
I guess you could be really unlucky and be that person where you need to hit the two opposite buttons, like square and circle, with your particular config. But at that point you probably should just set a button and make do with other ways of hitting some other combination.
Let's do this.
So we'll reserve judgment until then. Of course you can probably find lots of information on it and people being extremely hype about it in one way or another on Twitter almost immediately. And of course a bunch of people complaining about how broken it is. And a bunch of people complaining about how it's not broken enough. The FGC is a diverse place. Today's lounges, therefore, one here and one you should look for Just Divine, are almost certainly going to be at least changing host in about 20 minutes. Or even a little less. As far as I'm aware of the group plans, I expect them all to close completely and leave us with no active lounge after 8:30 Eastern today. Tomorrow's content is up in the air as usual. There's a chance of it being Guilty Gear. The upcoming Guilty Gear Strive beta weekend might not see us. We're still, like most of the FGC, feeling out our emotions and expectations of that game. Many people appear to be extremely hyped, and so far we haven't figured out why, because it doesn't look like our sort of thing, let's say. But Guilty Gear can be very, very confusing and sometimes very much surprising in terms of what it actually does, even when you think you understand what's going to happen. So, like most, we're probably going to have to reserve judgment until we get some hands-on. As mentioned before, most of us don't have characters that we actually want to play. More so I guess I can play this character to try out this game. And of course it could be extremely fun. Games are often quite fun early on into their life cycle, especially if you have enough understanding of fighting games in general to just decide who you're playing, what you want to do, and how you want to play them. The sort of person that is trained long enough to know how to input the sort of craziness that Guilty Gear sometimes requires is likely to enjoy the Strive beta as long as it, actually runs.
You lose.
We aren't sure what we're going to do about content relative to it, partially because almost everything we've seen so far has given us a relatively bad impression. But it's a lot of very small technical things, not, oh, I don't like how this game looks because it's too much this, or too much that, or too much this other thing. It's little things like how much damage X character does, and how easily they convert from this thing to another, and how hard it is to get in on X, and how much damage you do once you've done it, and Nagoriyuki's full screen Half-Life Super. Those are little things. But lots of people are very hyped, and I can see how at the extremely high level of skill that some Guilty Gear players have, they are not even seeing the same game as the rest of us. And I'm happy for them, because it looks like whatever they're seeing looks really fun. But even the high level-ish gameplay that we've seen so far hasn't indicated something that's likely to be fun to people who don't already have a very strong concept of fundamentals and what's going on. In other words, we feel as if the middle ground of player might not enjoy this game so much. If you are particularly casual, never played Guilty Gear before or similar, you don't know what to do, so you do things and hope they work, it's probably going to be more enjoyable than most games. If you know exactly what to do, are very good at spacing, they don't change much about the characters so far that we've seen, in terms of spacing and normals per se. Meaning that a Kai player from Guilty Gear Xrd is not going to have a whole lot of trouble adapting to Kai and Strive. In terms of, do I get punished for this? Where should I hit this normal? Those things are not our concerns at this time. But if you're in the middle, if you kinda know how to play Guilty Gear but not absolutely sure about all your stuff, or if you're in the situation of, as I mentioned, half the team and you don't actually have your character, so you have to learn some other characters' ranges and normals and new moves, even to try it, it might be more of a push. But since we don't want that to salt or cloud our opinions, we may not make any Strive content straight up. This is also more true because there's a chance that anything could just change.
It's go time. Let's do this.
And it would be sad and disingenuous to spend an entire beta weekend complaining this character does too much damage off this conversion, and then in the final build the damage is nerfed like 25%. You should definitely complain about those sorts of things to Art System Works on Twitter or so on, but just random streamers saying those things is not likely to have as much clout, and you'll just be known as the person who said that and probably had a big fight in your Twitch chat with people who believe it will be changed, people who believe it definitely won't be changed and the game is terrible, and one of those two things is going to happen and someone is going to be upset.
Fight.
So let's think positive thoughts. After all, if you, for whatever reason, don't like the way that Strive is balanced, don't like the way it feels, don't like the basic concept of how to play it because it's not your Guilty Gear, then don't play it. It's not your Guilty Gear. Rev 2 is still cheap. And is, amazingly, still not functionally a solved game. And I say that as someone who believes that Street Fighter is practically a solved game. It just happens to be a solved game that you have to play at a high level regardless of if you know the solutions. Guilty Gear can be like that, but not in every matchup. This is partially because of the vast amount of difference between characters, as in fundamental abilities, game plans, etc. You see this also in our other favorite game to play, Under Night. And honestly, this is the same thing. If you don't know how to do certain matchups in Under Night, you are just dying rapidly. The problem with the Strive beta that I will point out and can look out for, again, not something we will necessarily mention if we make any content, but something that is something to look for to decide how good the game can be in long term if you're not certain about it. Guilty Gear has generally not been a game before where at any point you could say you knew exactly what was going on. This is because usually so much was happening and your opponent had so many different routes through their combos, setups, weird cancels, and so on. And a lot of this involved very little damage actually being done after a while. So it was a lot of, I'm going to try to get you to this situation, and then you decide what's going to happen from there. Understanding your opponent's character could be easily done, but the one thing you didn't generally have to worry too much about, because of things like proration, and just the general way damage used to be done in Guilty Gear, is the idea of your opponent being able to do a move you couldn't see coming, convert off this move into massive damage, and then put you in another, more or less unreactable situation of massive damage. Because in Guilty Gear, even if you are placed into a situation you know you can't get out of, you can always break the combo, and that hasn't changed in Strive. What has changed is the general rhythm of Strive as a game. Guilty Gear is heavily about stressing your opponent out and making them fail to block, or making them misunderstand the situation. With a simplified game, if they try to keep that core, you'll find that the situations are more so counterintuitive than, hey, I'm stressed out so I can't see what's happening or I can't guess what's coming next.
Round 2.
A more visually simplistic and clear game actually somewhat reduces the capacity of the designers to give you these options. And that means the game could easily come down to more neutral decisions, less mix-ups, or more, let's say, footsies, even though the term is not quite right here, with people trying to open each other up for long periods and aiming to get the maximum damage off of it when it does happen, without necessarily trying to use much pressure. What we've seen of damage so far indicates that this would be very swingy, if not frustrating, for certain types of people. In short, if your opponent is able to dance around for 30 seconds, then land kick and you'll lose 75% of your health, there are games in the past where this was just the way it went, and some people quite enjoyed these. But it does mean that the gap between characters who are good at doing that and characters who are good at stressing you out in some way is likely to be somewhat larger. So, if you do look for things about Strive, or just play it yourself and try to get a feel for it, if you find that your character isn't so great at playing neutral, figure out whether or not this is because you lose out often, repeatedly, while trying to set up your situation, or if you basically lose out once you stop being able to pressure your opponent, because the game tends to become a little homogeneous in that case. And it's not Dragon Ball, where that's a flashy, fabulous show somewhat. Many mid-level people do still complain that the game basically comes down to touch of death or not. Where not is just blocking for a really long time because you've already seen everything, you can't be opened up, etc. We don't expect that to be what you're going to see in Guilty Gear. It has too many mechanics to make it work otherwise. But the ability to quickly shift your situation so that your opponent doesn't know exactly what's going on was normally counterbalanced by characters who did this not getting much afterward, and probably not needing to do it just twice.
Round 1. Fight!
Or simply it not coming up. And we're not certain that Strive is going to stop that situation this time. There are definitely good arguments to be made for, well, that's how fighting games are supposed to be, or that's how I want this specific fighting game to be. But it might be disappointing for those who have not played Guilty Gear like that before. Because while it is hard to see, especially at high level, or rather mid-high level, where some people are very good at doing gigantic combos, the skill involved in those things is recognizing I need to hit this, I need to confirm this way, and then I need to recognize what my opponent did so that I can make sure that I have all my stuff set up. This game works a lot like that as well. Recognizing more situations is a form of XP that does get you somewhere. And it's kind of meaningful regardless of what else you do.
Final round. Fight.
So if anything, it's the little counter that goes off. The chances that your opponent needs to do less work, less often, let's say. One could easily say it doesn't really change the overall match, it just makes it shorter. But there are definitely parts of Guilty Gear's build that make that a little less true. So we'll see in a week, rather a couple of days, 5 days, depending on whether or not you get day 1 access to it or not. But you shouldn't expect us to have much to say about it at that time. We'll give the developers some time to hear all of the feedback, and possibly send some because they tend to have questionnaires after these. So if you're not familiar with that, and have interest or time, it might benefit the community as a whole for you to give any opinions you have on whatever data collection system they use. Hopefully what little I've said might make it a little bit more helpful to developers, because I gotta tell you, I'm fairly sure that if you're not clear enough about what it is that really bothered you, so to speak, it just gets tossed in the pile with everyone else that says this game sucks. So if you take one thing away from this rant I've had before our stream ends, whenever anyone asks you why you don't like Guilty Gear and your answer is, my character doesn't do enough damage, or their characters do too much damage, see if you can figure out a when to add to that, because that is what developers and, in fact, other decent players have the most to say about. You might be able to get some help, someone telling you, well, this is how you avoid them getting to hit that button in the first place, or here's how you can get to a place where your better buttons hit. And if neither of those things exists, then it's the developers that need to hear about it. In the form of, this person's kick is too oppressive and when they do land it, I die. Because only the worst of game designers will just effectively go, oh well, don't get kicked then. And you can have at least that much faith in the Guilty Gear team, probably. I'm told that the offense and defense lounge went recently, and it looks like the footsie one will probably get repeated eventually. But that brings us to the end of the stream for tonight, and similarly the end of the lounges. You can find all our bots at 2-mk.org, including the upcoming Dan bot once Dan releases, probably day 1, let's hope. Content on our YouTube channel, and of course 2_mk_FGC on Twitter for information about when we start streaming, usually around 7 Eastern, and little things like bot previews. This has been Rillian 142MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.